Grin was responsible for some really spectacular games. Games that made a lasting impression on me. They may not have reached the highest heights, but they made quality games that made you grin from ear to ear. This is their story. Grin was founded in 1997 in Stockholm, Sweden by Bo and Ulf Andersson. The company got off to a rather slow start, oddly enough, with their first game of note, Ballistics, a high-octane racing game in the vein of Wipeout, which was released for the PC in 2001 to little fanfare. The game did get fairly decent reviews, with critics praising the visuals and the intense and exciting gameplay, but they lamented that the game only had 7 tracks and took little time to master and even less time to complete. Critics did take notice of the new engine that Grin had made in-house, codenamed Diesel, which would go on to power all of their future games. Ballistics would find some success with its arcade version that came out in the following year of 2002. While gamers were mostly enthralled with the experience, the lukewarm critical reception would become something of a company staple at Grin. Something that I sadly don't think they were grinning about, and yes, that was a terrible pun. In 2002, Grin also released Bandits, Phoenix Rising, in European regions, and in North America in 2003. Similarly to Ballistics, Bandits was another racing game, though this time the focus was on vehicular combat, in a vein similar to the Twisted Metal games of its day, and more recently the vehicular combat found in Rage 2. The game obviously took influence from the Mad Max films, and had a much stronger narrative than what was found in Ballistics. It was also a lengthier game, but its reception was slightly colder than Ballistics. And this time, there was no arcade version to rake in some decent profits. Still, by this point, Grin had proven that while their games did not get glowing reviews, they were capable of making above-average titles that many gamers greatly enjoyed. Maybe the games were not quite Grin-worthy, but hey, they put a mild smile on gamers' jaded faces. 3 years later in 2006, Grin would release their highest profile game to date, the PC port of Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter. However, unlike the ports of today, this was a totally different game from the console counterparts. Instead of being a cover-based third-person shooter, this was a first-person shooter that was similar to the original Ghost Recon games. It was built from the ground up by Grin utilizing their Diesel engine, and was more akin to the Rainbow Six games of the day than the more casual and action movie-inspired Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter for the Xbox 360. Reviews this time around were much better, with critics taking notice of the more tactical gameplay, larger maps, solid visuals, and faithful rendition of the narrative found in the Xbox 360 version. As a matter of fact, the PC release was the only version of the game aside from the 360 to get any kind of decent reviews, with the PS2 and Xbox releases being seen as far inferior to both the PC and 360 release. It would seem that Grin finally managed to put a smile on that face. And hey, they did it without needing razor blades. 1 year later, and Grin would release the PC sequel to Advanced Warfighter, which would again be built from the ground up by Grin and would feature the same first-person perspective gameplay. This time, it was not quite as well received as the first Advanced Warfighter. While it was seen as a competent and enjoyable game, the rushed turnaround time seemed to have hurt the game's potential, and this time, there was no weaker last-gen console offering to be seen as the lesser entry, which led to many smirks, but not so many grins. However, Grin's next title would be received better than any of their previous efforts, and also sadly, any of their future games. Time, it seems, was starting to run out for the little developer that could. In 2008, Grin would release their most accomplished game, Bionic Commando Rearmed, an HD remake of the classic Capcom platformer. Critics loved the visuals and how faithful the gameplay was remade. After all, it was still the same classic game, just with a whole new coat of paint. And it would stand out as one of the more beloved HD remakes of classic games. Rearmed bought the company a lot of goodwill, and it made the company quite a profit. This was one of those games that everyone seemed to buy at one point or another. It was very well made, and being an Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network title, it was also on the cheaper side, which meant a lot of gamers were more willing to give it a chance to make them smile. And yes, I still have more of those Grin-related puns. And now, we are at my favorite part of the story, and also the most unfortunate part of the story. See, Grin's next 3 games would leave a huge mark on my life as a gamer. One of them, in particular, would become one of my all-time favorite video games. And it would also be the catalyst for my making game-related videos. So these will always hold a special place in my heart. In a way, they made me grin the most. I told you I had more puns, but sadly they would also doom the company, right when it started to make actual waves. 2009 would see the release of not 1, not 2, but 3 major games from Grin. And while many gamers would adore these titles, and they would gather more fans as time went on, they would also be the worst received of any of Grin's games. March of 2009 saw the release of the video game sequel to the highly successful film Wanted. Wanted Weapons of Fate would continue the film's story and feature the voice talents of Terrence Stamp and Thomas Kretschmann, reprising their role from the film, with the game also utilizing James McAvoy's likeness. However, they did not utilize his voice. The game would be a cover-based shooter that picked up right after the film's end, and it would feature a mechanic that even allowed players to curve bullets. The gameplay was tightly refined, the level designs were superb, the game was packed with tons of exciting action, the visuals were of a high quality, and the story was a worthy successor to the film. Now, you are probably wondering, if it was so good, then why did it sell so poorly and get such poor reviews? See, this was 2009. This was a time when all games had multiplayer components and Weapons of Fate had none. The campaign was also very, very short and extremely linear. On the easiest setting, the game could be cleared in 3 to 4 hours, with the game only taking a maximum of 6 on the hardest settings. Now, this did not bother me. I ended up playing that game so many times I've lost count, but critics were very hard on the game's short length and lack of multiplayer. The game also did not feature much variety in terms of weaponry, and it was a fairly simple game, yet I actually think that's why it was so much fun. They had really great mechanics and the game was highly polished, so it always managed to be an enjoyable game to play through. Perhaps if it had been sold for $40 instead of $60, maybe it would have been more appreciated in its day. There is also the fact that they were hard at work on a total of 3 games at the time, which meant that each game would either be short or lack polish. Now they chose to make shorter, but highly refined gaming experiences. What happened next, however, is quite interesting. Releasing 3 games in the same year is quite a feat, especially for such a small company. But what about 2 games on the same day? That is exactly what Grin did. And this was the day that the smile, you guessed it, faded. May 19th, 2009 saw the release of Terminator Salvation, the video game prequel to the film that would come out that week as well. And it's easily Grin's weakest game. It has some cool ideas, and given that it is essentially Gears of War in the Terminator universe, it still manages to be a fairly fun experience. It is just as short as Weapons of Fate, and sadly, not quite as polished or enjoyable, but it is still the best Terminator game to date. Granted, I recognize that that is really not saying very much. The game featured the voice talents of a then unknown Nolan North, as well as Common and Moonblood Good reprising their roles from the film. Rose McGowan also played a brand new character, However, Christian Bale did not lend his voice or likeness to John Connor, which means that Connor looked like a generic dude, but the voice actor did give a solid performance. And the score really evoked the film's atmosphere. In some ways, the game, as subpar as it is better than the film it was based on, as it managed to capture the atmosphere of the future war quite well, and taking down Terminators was extremely satisfying, even if it got quite repetitive by the game's end. May 19th also saw the release of the highly anticipated Bionic Commando reboot that Capcom had outsourced to Grin. This would be Grin's most ambitious title, and in some ways their best. Unlike Wanted and Terminator, this game is pretty lengthy, and while it is still linear, it is far more open than their previous games. Of course, that did not save the game from being lambasted by the gaming press. The story, which features themes of terrorism, genetic modification, revenge, and some pretty high concept ideas, was easily my favorite part of the game. It was an odd mix of science fiction and cheesy macho action, but that's what made the story so entertaining, and also what seemed to put off so many critics. Nathan Spencer, the Bionic Commando, would get the worst of the criticism. For some, he was just too overly macho and seemed to enjoy killing just a little too much. I also think he might somehow be related to that assassin from Rick and Morty. You know, the one who just loves killing? 'Cause see, they both love killing, and not just that, they love to talk about how much they love killing. Gameplay is not quite as polished as Wanted, but the game was also trying some pretty inventive things, and I have yet to see a third-person shooter attempt gameplay like this. You can swing like Spider-Man on your bionic arm, and you have free use of your firearms, as well as some pretty sick melee attacks involving that huge-ass arm. Using your arm to zip to an enemy while you blast their face off was just fucking badass. Of course, aiming and hit detection could be a bit off, and the enemies would often take far too many shots to the face to kill. But, for the most part, the game controlled and played really well. There was the case of the game's somewhat frustrating boss fights. For some, the game would not seem very challenging, but to others, this was kind of a difficult game. And this was before difficult games were really popular, which meant that the game was also docked for its hefty skill requirement. This was a game that relied heavily on player skill, and if you sucked, it was your fault most of the time. Those who got really good at it, though, could pull off some incredible feats that I have never seen any other game replicate. This was not a flawless game, and I did not enjoy it as much as Wanted, but the ambition and inventive gameplay mechanics deserved far more praise than they got. These three games would ultimately capsize the burgeoning studio, as the poor reception and weak sales would doom the studio's next release before it even saw the light of day. Grin at the time was working on a game called Fortress. This was to be the first major spin-off in the Final Fantasy franchise. It was meant to be a real-time, open-world RPG that was going to take place in the same universe as Final Fantasy XII. It had started as an unlicensed fantasy game, and Square Enix took interest when Grin was shopping the game around to various publishers for additional funding. The game was to feature a more realistic art style and have heavy Nordic influences, which Square was initially okay with. Then payments never arrived. Grin was supposed to have gotten funding for the project from Square, but it was late. However, the studio was not too worried, as this was still early in development and they had 3 games to release. Ooh, yeah. They did hope that those games would help their cash flow problem. Ooh, sorry. But they still had faith in Square Enix. Of course, those 3 games they released only made the situation worse, and by the time all 3 had launched, Square was starting to get worried, and then they decided that the Nordic art style was not suited for the Final Fantasy brand. They demanded that the game be retooled, and they also demanded that the game's assets be faxed to them, of all things. What the fuck, faxing? My god. And that was something that Grin said would have been impossible. Grin tried to rework the game, and they put in a ton of effort to the project, which they would later refer to as their unrealized masterpiece, that they sadly were never allowed to finish. While Square stated that Grin did not respond to the requests for the change in art style, Grin would remain adamant that they had begun to rework the game as requested. Further, Square would state that the game never met the milestones that were agreed upon, and that is why they were never paid. Grin also vehemently denied these allegations. I think it is very clear that the poor reception of Grin's previous games had them quite worried. Unlike Bionic Commando, which was a franchise that Capcom looked to revitalize, Final Fantasy was still, and is still, Square's biggest and most important intellectual property, and there was no way that they would allow anyone to diminish the viability of that franchise. While I understood those worries, it should have been obvious to Square that if Grin was given enough time and most of all funding, they could deliver an incredible game. Most look at their last 3 games as failures, but were they really? A company smaller than most made 3 near AAA quality games that may have been short but were also quite fun and very well made, and in my opinion, had they only had more time and more funding, there is truly no limit to what this little company could have achieved. I think time will be far kinder to Grin and their games because this studio came out of nowhere and was able to develop 3 memorable games for release in the same year. Games that did not look or play like budget titles. Games that will continue to hold a special place in many gamers' hearts. After Grin shut its doors, the Anderson brothers would go on to create Overkill Software, who would see success with their Payday games. These were made on a much smaller scale, but they managed to be a great success for the Reborn company until a little title called Overkill's The Walking Dead. After the success of Payday 2, the Anderson brothers suffered a falling out. Ulf was burnt out from leading the development on Payday 2 and decided to leave the company, which is likely the reason that The Walking Dead was a total failure. Bo was clearly the one in charge of business, but Ulf, he was the one who knew the most about game design, and losing him meant that their next game could only be a total failure, worse than anything that had happened at Grin. Ulf would go on to create a new game studio called 10 Chambers Collective, and is hard at work on a new IP titled GTFO, or Get the Fuck Out, a survival horror shooter that's in the same vein as Payday and, yep, The Walking Dead. Whoa, big surprise there. While this game has yet to launch, pre-release buzz has been very positive, and it seems it will be the true successor to Payday. Overkill also has a game called Storm in development, but other than it being a co-op sci-fi shooter, we know nothing about this game. There's a trailer for a VR experience titled Storm, but it really doesn't say very much, and at the moment, Overkill's future may be in the air due to the colossal failure that was The Walking Dead. Hopefully, Overkill and 10 Chambers can go on to succeed where Grin failed, but it is a shame that after such a comeback with the Payday franchise, that Overkill would stumble so badly with their Walking Dead shooter. And there you have it, the story of Grin, a company that did manage to make quite a few gamers. You know what I'm gonna say, and yes, it is lame, but I'm gonna say it anyway. A studio that managed to make quite a few gamers grin from ear to ear.